20 armed soldiers. That is how many IRG fighters stormed the MSC Francesca, one of the world's largest container ships in the Strait of Hormuz on Wednesday morning. 20 men, armed to the teeth, in the words of a crew member who managed to get a message out before communications were cut. They came aboard fast. They took the bridge. They ordered the captain, a Montenegrin national, to follow their instructions. And then the MSC Francesca, along with the Epaminondas seized at the same time, began moving toward Iran's coast. Today, Thursday, April 24th, both ships are at anchor near Bandar Abbas, Iran's main port city on the Persian Gulf. Aboard those two ships are approximately 40 human beings: Filipino deckhands, Ukrainian engineers, Montenegrin officers, Croatian crew members. 40 people who had nothing to do with the decision to go to war, 40 people who took maritime jobs to support families in Manila and Kyiv and Podgorica and Zagreb, 40 people who are now in Iranian custody in the middle of a geopolitical standoff between two nuclear-capable powers with no confirmed timeline for their release. 5 governments are demanding answers: Greece, Croatia, Montenegro, Ukraine, the Philippines. Iran has said nothing about their condition. This is Respect B, and the story we are telling today is not about oil prices or ceasefire extensions or naval blockades. It is about 40 people who woke up Wednesday morning on a ship in the Strait of Hormuz and by nightfall were hostages in Bandar Abbas. Stay with me. Let's start with the people themselves, because in the coverage of ship seizures and oil prices and IRG statements, the actual human beings aboard these vessels have been almost completely invisible. The MSC Francesca is a large container ship, Panamanian-flagged, Italian-owned, operated by MSC, the world's biggest container shipping company. Large container vessels of this type require a minimum crew of approximately 20 people to operate safely. The full crew complement can be larger. What we know about the MSC Francesca crew: the captain is from Montenegro. For sailors, including the captain, are Montenegrin nationals. Montenegro's government confirmed this within hours of the seizure and immediately began diplomatic efforts to secure their release. 2 crew members are Croatian. Croatia's foreign ministry confirmed their presence aboard and said it is, quote, actively working on the protection of Croatian citizens. The remaining crew nationalities have not been fully disclosed. MSC, the ship's operator, one of the world's largest shipping companies, has declined to comment publicly. This silence is standard practice in hostage situations. Public statements can complicate negotiations. The Epaminondas, Greek-owned, Liberia-flagged, has a crew of 21 members. The Greek Coast Guard confirmed their nationalities: Ukrainians and Filipinos. 21 Ukrainians and Filipinos aboard a ship seized by Iran at a moment when Ukraine is simultaneously fighting a grinding war against Russia, when Filipino seafarers represent one of the largest maritime workforces on Earth, when both countries' governments are already stretched by crises that have nothing to do with the Strait of Hormuz. Ukraine's foreign ministry issued a statement demanding information about its citizens and calling for their immediate release. The Philippines, which sends more seafarers to work on international vessels than almost any other country on Earth, has its diplomatic machinery activated. Filipino sailors work on ships across every ocean. This is not the first time Filipino crews have been caught in geopolitical hostage situations. It will not be the last, but each time it happens, families in the Philippines are watching. 40 people total across the 2 ships, 5 nationalities confirmed, possibly more aboard, and this is what their families know right now: that their fathers, sons, brothers, husbands sailed into the Strait of Hormuz on Wednesday morning and have not been heard from since. Let me reconstruct exactly how these 40 people ended up in Iranian custody, because the sequence reveals something important about how Iran is operating. Both ships had been waiting in the Persian Gulf since April 18th, 4 days of sitting at anchor like the 230 other tankers waiting for a window to transit safely. On Tuesday night, Trump announced the ceasefire extension. The captains of both vessels or their operators monitoring from shore made a calculation. The ceasefire is extended. The diplomatic situation has stabilized. This is the window. Move now. The MSC Francesca turned off its AIS transponder, the tracking system that broadcasts a ship's location, and maneuvered toward the strait. The Epaminondas did the same, turned off its transponder, headed for the strait. Going dark is a common practice in contested waters. Ships in the Red Sea during the Houthi attacks did the same thing. The logic is that if nobody can track you, you cannot be targeted. The logic failed because Iran was not tracking these ships through their transponders. Iran was watching the strait physically. Navy patrol boats, surveillance systems on the Iranian coastline, the kind of persistent maritime surveillance that a navy operating in its own home waters maintains regardless of whether civilian transponders are broadcasting. Both ships dark on the tracking screens were visible to Iranian eyes on the water. The IRG waited until they were in position, then moved. 20 armed soldiers boarded the MSC Francesca. The crew members' message, 20 Iranians armed to the teeth stormed the ship, describes what happened in seconds. A large container ship cannot outrun IRG speedboats. It cannot maneuver to avoid boarding. It is, in the words of maritime security analysts, a slow-moving target in a narrow waterway controlled by the party that wants to seize it. The ships were immobilized, escorted to Iran's coast. Tracking data shows both vessels near Bandar Abbas as of Thursday morning. The IRG's official justification was that the ships operated without authorization and tampered with navigation systems. The tampered navigation systems they are referring to are the turned-off transponders. Iran created a system. Ships must receive Iranian authorization to transit. Ships that transit without authorization or that turn off transponders to avoid detection are in violation of Iranian maritime regulations. Under international law, none of this is legal. The Strait of Hormuz is an international waterway. Iran cannot require authorization fees or coordination from vessels transiting it, but international law is not being enforced in the Strait of Hormuz. Right now, the IRG is. Let's be direct about what Iran is doing with these 40 sailors. This is not piracy in the conventional sense. Pirates seize ships for cargo or ransom. Iran is not asking for cargo or cash from these specific vessels. Iran is creating leverage. The MSC Francesca and Epaminondas crews are bargaining chips in a negotiation that has nothing to do with maritime law. They are leverage against the United States naval blockade. They are leverage against the 5 governments whose citizens are now in Iranian custody. They are leverage against the international community that is meeting in London to design a multinational mission to force the strait open, and they are leverage against the broader diplomatic process, the second round of talks that Iran's fractured government has not yet agreed to attend. Think about what Iran now has. It has 40 foreign nationals from 5 countries that are not party to the U.S.-Iran conflict, countries that have generally tried to stay neutral, countries whose governments now have a direct, personal, human stake in the outcome of negotiations they were previously watching from a distance. Greece, a NATO member, now has its citizens in Iranian custody. Croatia, a NATO member, now has its citizens in Iranian custody. Montenegro, a NATO member, now has its citizens in Iranian custody. Ukraine, currently fighting Russia, desperately dependent on Western support, now has its citizens in Iranian custody. The Philippines, a U.S. treaty ally in the Pacific, now has its citizens in Iranian custody. 3 NATO members, a U.S. ally, a country the West has spent 2 years supporting against Russian aggression. All of them now have to engage with Iran directly to get their people back. Iran has taken a bilateral dispute with the United States and transformed it into a multilateral humanitarian crisis with stakeholders across Europe, Eastern Europe, and Southeast Asia. That is not an accident, that is strategy. Let's look at how each of the 5 governments is responding, because the differences reveal exactly how difficult this situation is. Greece is the most vocal. The Epaminondas is Greek-owned. The Greek Coast Guard confirmed the crew nationalities. The Greek government demanded the immediate and unconditional release of the vessel and crew. Greece's foreign minister spoke by phone with Iran's foreign minister IRGC on Thursday. What did IRGC say? Nothing public has been released from that call. Croatia confirmed 2 of its nationals are aboard and said it is, quote, actively working. No further details. Montenegro confirmed 4 of its nationals, including the captain, and said its foreign ministry is, quote, taking all necessary measures. No further details. Ukraine fighting a war against Russia with 21 of its sailors now in Iranian custody issued a statement demanding information and calling for immediate release. Ukraine's government is simultaneously managing the most intensive phase of its war with Russia, a U.S. administration that has been inconsistent in its support, and now a hostage situation. In the Persian Gulf, the Philippines, which has the largest maritime workforce of any nation on Earth, with hundreds of thousands of Filipino sailors working on international vessels, activated its diplomatic response through its embassy in Tehran and the Department of Migrant Workers. Filipino seafarers are on ships in every ocean. They are on Iranian ships, they are on the ships that transit the Strait of Hormuz, they are among the 20,000 seafarers currently trapped in the Persian Gulf. This is not the first time Filipino maritime workers have been caught in a geopolitical crisis. In 2022, Filipino seafarers were trapped on vessels in Ukrainian ports when Russia invaded. In 2024, Filipino crew members were on ships attacked by Houthis in the Red Sea. Every time their government activates the same machinery, diplomatic notes, embassy contact, calls for release, and every time the families wait, the U.S. government's response to the seizure of ships belonging to NATO allies and a Pacific Treaty partner has been so far limited to Pentagon statements about the blockade continuing and Truth Social posts about Iran collapsing financially. No direct statement about the hostage crews. No announced diplomatic intervention on behalf of allied citizens. No indication that the seizure of Greek, Croatian, Montenegrin, Ukrainian, and Filipino nationals will change the American calculus on the blockade that Iran says made this seizure inevitable. While 40 sailors are held in Bandar Abbas, a different kind of hostage is being held simultaneously: the global economy. Brent crude oil reached $102 per barrel on Thursday. Before this war began on February 28, Brent was at $72. In 55 days, oil has risen 42%, 72 to 102. That's it. For a moment, a 42% increase in the price of the commodity that underpins every manufactured product, every food delivery, every commute, every flight, every heated building in the Northern Hemisphere. Airline tickets are rising. Lufthansa has canceled 20,000 flights. United Airlines has forecast profits below Wall Street estimates. Every airline that flies through Middle Eastern airspace or depends on Gulf region routes is absorbing costs that their pricing models did not account for. Fertilizer prices tied directly to natural gas from the Gulf are 15 to 20% higher than pre-war levels. American farmers planted spring crops this week against a supply chain that has no confirmed resolution date. Those crops feed the United States through the rest of 2026 and into 2027. UK polling shows 1 in 10 British citizens are already stockpiling fuel. 1 in 10. In a country that has not experienced wartime fuel shortages since the 1970s oil embargo, households are filling jerry cans and extra tanks because they do not know what next week looks like. The International Energy Agency's 32 member states released 400 million barrels from emergency reserves in March. That release bought some time. It did not fix the structural problem, which is that 20% of the world's seaborne oil and gas trade cannot flow normally because the Strait of Hormuz is a war zone, and now the war zone has 40 hostages in it, and the negotiations that might end the war zone are deadlocked, and the blockade that is strangling Iran's economy at $500 million per day is the same blockade that Iran says justified seizing the ships. The economic hostage and the human hostages are the same crisis seen from different angles. 40 sailors in Bandar Abbas, oil at $102, 5 governments demanding release, a blockade continuing, a ceasefire that exists in name only. Here is what the next 48 hours actually contain. The diplomatic track which has been running through Pakistan now has a new and urgent dimension. Getting those 40 sailors released requires Iran to make a decision. That decision is connected to every other decision in the negotiation. If Iran uses the hostages as a bargaining chip demanding blockade suspension in exchange for crew release, it has created a new pressure point that the U.S. must respond to. Releasing blockade pressure to free NATO members' citizens is politically complicated for Trump. Not releasing it while NATO allies demand action on their hostages is also politically complicated. Iran may have just made the path to a second round of talks slightly clearer by giving everyone, including NATO allies, a personal stake in the outcome, or Iran may have made it harder by convincing the 30-plus countries meeting in London that Iran cannot be trusted to honor any agreement and that the multinational Hormuz mission needs to proceed regardless of what happens in Islamabad. The London conference is producing a plan. British and French defense officials have said whatever mission they design will only activate after a, quote, sustained ceasefire. The ship seizures make that condition harder to meet, and the IRGC in a statement connected to the seizures warned that it is operating on what it calls a silent battlefield during the, and these are their exact words, so-called ceasefire. The so-called ceasefire, that is Iran's own military describing the current situation. Not a ceasefire, a so-called ceasefire. 40 sailors in Bandar Abbas, oil at 102, 5 governments on the phone to Tehran, and Iran's own military calling the peace fake. Wednesday morning, 20 armed IRGC soldiers boarded a container ship in the Strait of Hormuz. They took the bridge, they told the captain to follow, they escorted 2 ships to Bandar Abbas. Tonight 40 people are in Iranian custody. They are not politicians, they are not soldiers, they are not the architects of the blockade or the war or the ceasefire. They are sailors. People who went to sea because it was a job, because it paid for a family in Manila or Kyiv or Podgorica or Zagreb, because someone had to crew the ships that carry the goods that sustain the world economy. And now they are bargaining chips in a negotiation between 2 governments, neither of which is theirs, over a waterway that neither of them controls. 5 governments are demanding their release. Iran has said nothing about their condition. The blockade continues. Oil is at $102. And in London 30 countries are designing a military mission to open a strait that just became, for 40 families across 5 countries, not a geopolitical abstraction, but the place where someone they love is being held. This is Respect. Subscribe, because this story now has 40 faces, and they deserve to be seen.